one of the things that we have to talk about is that settings can exacerbate those efforts to maintain those professional boundaries across all those lines. Right? We're seeing increases in tech, daily, right? We have traditional classrooms still. We also have fully online and hybrid classrooms. So we have to attend to the various elements that either prohibit or decrease building those positive student-faculty relationships, or could potentially increase boundary crossing. So when we talk about digital environments, for example, since we're all online right now, we know that they have high levels of documented communication, right? Emails or timestamps, but at the same time, they create that physical distance and can possibly disrupt the rapport building and the relationship building that you're doing with your student. So the more intentional you can be from the very beginning, the more likely you are to build those individual, unique relationships with each of the students in your classroom. And some of the elements that you have to attend to are multicultural awareness, right? But also you have to consider the fact that when you're in an online environment, we're working with a more diverse student body. So we're going to have students who are less tech savvy, right? And that also emphasizes the need for gatekeeping in these situations.
So, Corinne, I want to offer an alternative perspective. I actually had a new experience in the previous week, and it occurs to me that it's something to be mindful of for both faculty members as well as clinicians. And essentially what happened was I had a supervisee find my personal cell phone number online. Now, the truth of the matter is that having been in the field with the same phone number for more than 20 years, you can find my Vita. You can find it. It's not hidden. But I'd openly provided a business number, which was free to be used. And so it was a very distinct boundary crossing that occurred on a weekend on my personal cell phone number that required me to attend to it very directly. So you can have the same exact thing happen with a client. You could have the same thing happen with a student. And it can feel very invasive, but you can also find yourself minimizing the circumstance if you're feeling conflict avoidant. So I think it's important to say, one, be mindful of what you post that can be accessed virtually. And if you are going to have it out there, you want to think about how you're going to handle it if there's a crossover with your preferred contact information. I didn't feel offended. I knew that the effort was really to reach me, but it did feel like a boundary violation. It felt a little creepy, just to be honest, because I had provided all that information. So I think it's important to just say the words and give it a name, that it does happen. And people very routinely sit down and look up. This crosses over into social media. And the reason we have to be really mindful of keeping those accounts separate and not friending anyone with whom we have a power differential in our relationship. So I'll stop.
No, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And when we talk about social media, I was recently talking to some colleagues who were saying, well, I had these students in the master's program, and they graduated from the master's program, and they friended me on Facebook. And that is fine, right? We're colleagues now, or if that's what you choose to do, okay. Then those same students applied for the doctoral program in which that faculty member was teaching. And the faculty member said, I don't know what to do because I don't want to unfriend them because that feels rude. But this is clearly a boundary issue, right? We're crossing roles now. And so my advice to her was, I said, well, why don't you pick up the phone and call your student?
I
and
would
just
say
say,
flat out, our roles have changed, have shifted yet again,
yes,
and we have a new dynamic. And so
yes,
I want to give you a heads up that I'm removing you from my friends list for the time being. And when you complete the program, give me a shout back.
yes, exactly. And that's what I think that's what I'm trying to emphasize, is that some of these situations can feel very complicated, and sometimes they are, but we're required to have those conversations and that communication that feels uncomfortable. But in doing so, we clearly set that boundary and the expectation for our roles and our relationships moving forward, right? So it's really a matter of, from the very beginning, setting it and being okay with having those conversations. In as clinicians, we have those conversations a lot, right? So we can kind of rely on some of those skills that we already have.
It can become, I do want to honor the fact that there are occasions that create blurry edges. And I can use myself as an example. Early in my career, I worked in a very small rural area. And so there were occasions that people with whom I had a professional relationship, clients, their kid might end up on the same ball team as my kid. And so it's just about learning how to navigate that and having a very open dialogue, and sometimes making tough decisions about what you're going to do, like having your plumber show up in a flooding emergency only to have your plumber be your client and have to decide whether you're going to let them in your house or whether you're going to let the house flood. So it's tough.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Well, it looks like we've got somebody on the chat. Yeah, I agree, Tanya. And I think in most cases, the students do understand, especially when you just say, and I mean, even in the example that I provided, you can say, remember when you were in your master's program and we weren't friends on social media? I have this policy where I'm not friends in that way with my students. And so let's, traverse this together in this new relationship. And I think for the most part, you're right. Yeah, so are you, Laura. and the truth is that sometimes our students don't understand. Yes, exactly, Kelly. It's a perfect opportunity for modeling how to behave, right? You're right. She is great with those. Oh, shoot. Okay. So I know we just gave some examples, but I just want you to think for a second and then, respond via chat to some of these questions, because this is actually a real life, basically a real life situation that happened for me. So, like I said, I'm a faculty member in a PhD program. I was assigned a teaching assistant. The TA and I had really good rapport. I taught him several classes. I'd agreed to be the chair of the dissertation. I'd written all these recommendations. We were publishing together. And then I got this, kind of abrupt request via email, using language that I wasn't quite familiar with coming from that student. And the TA was talking about, being really frustrated with a colleague of mine. They weren't belligerent, but were pretty unprofessional in the language used to describe my colleague. Now, of course, unbeknownst to the TA, I happened to agree with the assessment of my colleague's feedback at the time. So it was just kind of this situation in which I had to figure out, how do I respond in a way that's professionally appropriate, that's supporting this relationship, but that's also clearly setting this professional expectation of how we behave, how we write, and how we communicate about others in the field. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how you could respond in this situation to if this were your TA, that might reflect some of those ideas of professionalism that yet would not alienate the TA or perhaps be damaging to the relationship you've built. What do you guys think?
I'll talk to that. So I would make a space where I would say, I understand you're venting, you're frustrated, and your feelings are very valid. However, in writing, you need to convey your feelings in a more professional way. You know, I just think that would set the precedence of, hey, this is the expectation for you professionally. However, personally, you're validating your feelings.
Yeah, exactly, right? So maintaining those boundaries, right? And that positive student-faculty relationship, while also setting that reminder that, hey, sounds like you're feeling really frustrated right now. Let's talk about some of that, and we can address the feedback together. Sounds like you disagree with some of it. But first we need to talk about what's appropriate behavior. Thank you. Yeah, Margaret, you're absolutely right. Yeah, something we do deal with occasionally in higher ed, but just every now and then. Feelings of frustration. Yeah. And also, one of the things I find myself reminding my students of all the time is that they should really be careful not to say things in email, because that is a record of communication. That things are going to upset them. Reading it once through, taking a break from it, coming back to it later, then responding is always going to result in more appropriate behavior, because we're human. We all have reactions to things. And as we know, in email, tone can be misinterpreted all the time, right? So we might read something that in a totally completely different way than was originally intended. So really kind of attending to all those. Now, I'm trying to be aware of my colleagues' time too. So, just a refresher, so that proactive communication, right? Setting those expectations. Yeah, you're exactly right, Kathleen. So, and Kathleen's talking about validating those feelings, and bringing in that reminder. Oh, good. So finding that support. Finding that support in those situations that you write are not uncommon, unfortunately. And the thing is that we can do a lot of damage if we aren't being aware of what's happening with and for our students, right? To that relationship that we have, right? So having that clear process to address those issues, those developmental issues, right? To talk about the professional behavior, and then also a clear process for intervention, remediation, and dismissal too. So I'm going to go ahead and let Laura kind of take over from here. We talk about civility.
Well, this is probably where we began, actually, when talking about this presentation. And when we say cyber civility, essentially, we just had an introduction with Corinne's example, which is receiving an email that has a tone or language choices that are perhaps inappropriate. So in the virtual environment, and we have many students who intend to become distance counselors and become credentialed in that arena. So this applies not only to the student-faculty relationship, but also to the counselor-client relationship if you're engaging in that format. To Corinne's previous point, impulsivity can really be our downfall. I don't know about you, but I know if I'm having an exchange via email or in a virtual capacity where I'm really not in the presence with someone, it gives me sort of an artificial sense of safety. There's a certain amount of anonymity that you believe exists, and actually it does not. The same is true in academic settings. For example, in discussion board changes, you may see someone's photo or they have an avatar, but you're really, creates a perception for you, but you don't necessarily personalize that. And it's as I mentioned, I forgot not to be terrible is not a good enough answer for being terrible. Being generally kind and respectful in all our dialogue is important. Unfortunately, that happens both in a clinical arena as well as an academic arena. So I want to give you, also share some examples of things I've encountered, and I would love to hear your feedback. We can move forward, Corinne. So let's say that you're in a discussion board and a student's name has been misspelled in a peer's response. So the student has posted, a peer has responded and misspelled the name. And then when a different peer responds, the student whose name was spelled incorrectly makes a rather passive-aggressive statement in their response and says, "At least you spelled my name right." How might you handle that if you were trying to engage with a peer? Would that shut you down or leave you feeling like you didn't want to engage with them? Well, what I found was that I got offline messages indicating a sense of disrespect. So I think setting a tone for respectful communication is one of the keys for success, regardless of whether you're in a clinical or an academic session. So let's say you have a student that persistently asks for time extensions for late work, and after multiple extensions have been granted, the professor draws a boundary and says you're going to have a late penalty. And the student responds to the professor saying, "Clearly you aren't a believer because I would never treat someone that way." What would that mean to you if you got that response? Or what emotion would come up for you?
I think that one, Laura, was shutting me down a little more quickly than the first example that you provided. I would take it perhaps more personally.
It feels personal. I think you're right. And it also feels shaming. I think that's a fair word. And it also lacks cultural sensitivity, which is certainly something we're looking for in a counseling student or a clinician, because it imposes the spiritual values of the writer onto the recipient. So it's interesting how one statement can turn into something so complex. And lastly, how about this for an example? When a professor was returning feedback instead of about writing, about APA form and style, the instructor inadvertently typed ACA instead of APA, referencing writing. And the student responded, "Why should I accept a grade from a teacher that doesn't even know what the American Counseling Association is?" Now I'm being distracted by the
Yes, we have a comment that says rude.
Yeah.
In that box.
Yeah, fair enough. At the end of the day, we're all human. We're all capable of mistakes. We all have to be willing to have enough ego strength to own them and to make amends if there's one to be made. Yes, Kelly Coker, it is tempting to make it into a joke. And yet at the same time, if you're in a position to receive that feedback that your leadership may see, that also can leave you feeling very vulnerable. Because even a genuine mistake, when your competence gets called out in such an overt way, it can leave you second guessing all over the place, even if you know that is not the case. Somebody said, a similar situation in previous place of employment, immediate supervisor was excellent in supporting me with expressing my frustrations, validating concerns, and helping me move forward, and set a great example in not so uncommon circumstances. That is ideal. That sounds like the gold standard. And yes, the last one is just rude. So in terms of best practice, when you encounter these sorts of things, regardless of the setting that you're in, checking your own understanding. I think that the point that Tanya made about saying they're sorry, sometimes doing a check-in just like you would in a session, verifying that you've heard them correctly, giving them an opportunity to clarify. Can you explain your thoughts to me in a different way so I can make sure I understand? And giving a dialogue a chance to have a fresh start, that can help if your first impression is that something's really obnoxious. Also, you can always invite others to check in about your own messages. Just like other people's thoughts can be, we can all rearrange. We can all have a dialogue in our own heads. And so if you can add an example to the message that you're trying to get across, sometimes that can be really helpful. So for example, if I'm being sort of sarcastic in a response, I might add an example so that it makes it clear that it's not personal. Like saying, I like this debate about as much as a cat likes taking a bubble bath. The truth of the matter is sarcasm can be very lost in written format. So we have to be extremely careful with that.
Yeah, there's an appropriate time and place for humor, which can help, but also attending to the idea that the interpretation.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that in terms of best practice, being more proactive and less reactive would be our ideal. Email and classroom exchanges can be really complicated, but keeping in mind that your best practice is to listen to hear as opposed to listen to respond. You listen, you hear, and then you respond. And that encourages people to treat people like they want to be treated, and the words that they would use face to face. Frankly, if it is something that you would not be prepared to walk in and say in those words to somebody at their desk or eyeball to eyeball, it is likely that you want to rephrase. Informal, well, one of the things that we were speaking specifically to was an educational setting for an online environment, and that is where assessment comes into play. And I think Kristi Cannon can speak a bit about the importance of having formal assessment of professional dispositions, because someone's professionalism and capacity for appropriate boundaries and respectful communication critical to the counselor identity development. And treating yourself and your colleagues with the respect that they deserve. I've had this discussion many times with colleagues about professors and first names versus doctor. And people tend to be quite divided. There's often not middle ground on this. Some say, I couldn't care less, and some say, no, I earned it, I want them to use it. But one of the things that you can do to set a precedent for respecting the integrity and the experts of your colleagues is when you reference your colleagues, reference them by calling them Dr. Bridges and Dr. Cannon, because that establishes that you have a boundary about how someone else is going to speak about your colleague in front of you. And I think that applies back to Dr. Bridges' example previously. All right, so we brought up social media just briefly, and I think we can kind of smooth over this pretty quickly because we've already talked about it. One of the things that happens that's important to mention is that because we do have platforms that are virtual, particularly with any business, if you're in a private practice, for example, and you have a website or you have, what is it, like TripAdvisor, you know, we have the opportunity to rate everything. And so you have the potential of someone being disgruntled and leaving a really ugly comment on the quality of service. And some say, well, this should extend to faculty. My son, who is a college student, recently asked me if I had ever looked myself up on ratemyprofessor.com, and I said no, and you better not either. So I don't know if he did, but he didn't tell me, which was wise. So part of what is worth considering is whether it's the freedom of expression and about social norms, or institutional rules that are in place to help maintain the civility that we need in order to have a productive teaching environment. You know, there's a lot of conversation that happens around whether students should have rights as consumers. And yes, students do pay for their program, but they're not buying grades. So it's important to make sure that there is not an atmosphere that's facilitated that endorses the idea that tuition is equal to purchasing a certain grade. So here are some more examples, because I thought that I would dig in and allow you the opportunity to see some of the things that can happen in the world of virtual learning. After a course, a group of students express their frustrations on a Facebook page, less than complimentary towards the instructor. I no longer fear hell. I took a class with Dr. Haddock. Well, no one has a comment on that, but I'll say that it was not an easy thing. Ouch. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So is the student a consumer metaphor appropriate in the educational context of online learning? The bottom line is there's already stigma that gets fought, and ironically, it's okay. Ironically, I think that if you surveyed students, and that research may have been done, and I don't actually know, but I think if you surveyed students, you would find that those who are members of an online instructional community would say that the rigor and the standards are even more rigorous than land-based learning. So best practices for handling these sorts of issues, including specific language in the student handbook, particularly addressing social media, that the students are expected not to openly criticize their service providers. Assessment of professional dispositions, again, this is a common theme that runs through all of this. And not compromising the teaching standards that you outline on a syllabus. Upholding the requirements. It makes it really difficult if there's not consistency among and between sections or professors. And that's not to decrease the autonomy of instruction, but to have a united front as a practice provider in a clinical setting, or as a faculty member as part of a program. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So So the last thing I wanted to just touch on briefly, and we've integrated this along the way, is academic integrity. This is something we see with fair regularity, cheating on tests and quizzes, or plagiarism. At the end of the day, taking credit for someone else's work without adequately citing your sources is theft of intellectual property. So we do have academic integrity and academic honesty expectations. I can't, right off the top of my head, think of an example of how that might extend to a clinical setting. but certainly in an academic environment. We see examples with plagiarism software and high language matches, but that is in fact one of the recommendations for maintaining academic integrity, which is to use plagiarism software consistently, and even for assignments that are not routine, that are not automatically run through it, that faculty members occasionally run them randomly, and making calls and asking questions. Again, I made a call just today, this morning, to ask a student to just talk to me about her assignment preparation process because of an exact language match. And I think because of the approach that I took, what I ended up having was a dialogue that felt very honest about having collaborated with a colleague. She's in a cohort. One of her best friends is in the same course, but a different section. And they did their homework together. And at the end of the day, they were doing the same assignment. They were working together, and it just so happened that her colleague submitted first. So she got tagged, and we had to have a conversation about using your own words and paraphrasing, and the importance of not sharing so exactly that it becomes a replicated effort that shows up as plagiarism. Some other strategies are things like randomizing test questions. You know, at the end of the day, if you're in an online environment, often you have curated content. So one of the strategies that you have for not having to change a test every term is to have a big enough question bank that all students don't have the same questions in the same order. So simple strategies like that, and tracking patterns of behavior. And you would do the same with your client. If you noted a pattern of behavior, then that certainly delivers a different message than a one-time occurrence. So I'm going to shift now and move to Kristi and a conversation about cultural competence, which is certainly critical here.
Forward, Corinne. You want to cover these, Laura? Are you good? Okay. So I know we're kind of running short on time, but we wanted to also cover in this presentation a little bit around cultural competence in online, because as you know, we have a variety of new situations, as we've been talking about, things that are different, difficult, more challenging when we start working at a distance with one another, with our students, with our colleagues. Certainly if we think about working in counseling at a distance. And really what we're finding, or at least I've had experience with in regard to the two online institutions I've worked for, is that there are a lot of policies that are in place that kind of get developed as programs are developing, and a lot of work around inclusivity and diversity and even disability and being mindful of that, but they aren't always integrated when you start thinking about a program, and when you also are thinking about the balancing act that you have with regard to gatekeeping and the things that we've already been talking about. So we wanted to kind of talk too about unique circumstances and situations to be mindful of as well with regard to this area. So we'll give a couple examples here as well. And if you want to move it forward. So we'll start a little bit with talking about disabilities. And obviously this presentation is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, where we have a high reliance on auditory and visual, and not all of our students and certainly potentially clients in the future are going to rely as heavily on this. And we have to be mindful of that. And we have to be mindful of how we're developing and how we're supporting those students. And one of the things that I did in preparation for this presentation was to really try and understand what are the values and what brings people online. And that's certainly true, I think, of all of our students, but what gets really unique to our students that have differing abilities is trying to understand that for them, there are things like managing a schedule that is valuable. So whereas that's valuable to me because I have young kids and I need some flexibility, there are also things like physical disabilities that require you, if you're in a wheelchair, to have to go up to campus and get in and out and schedule transportation. And that's not always easy. So that's one reason that they come in. The visibility component. So for our students and again, future clients, potentially knowing that I can disclose or have you know as much or as little about my ability level or differing abilities as I want to. And so that therefore then allows me some equal footing so that I have some, you know, you're talking to me, we're having dialogue in the discussion board, or we're exchanging ideas and you see me in a different light because you're not looking at my abilities or differing abilities. But in the same vein as we have some benefits and value, there definitely is that perceived isolation for these students. And this is true, I think, of all our students. And Corinne talked about this at the beginning, just the relationships are so fundamental with our students that have differing abilities, because there is that sense of being isolated online. And even though I can disclose or not disclose, there's some level of, you know, I can be alone in this. So communication becomes that much more important. And you've heard us talk about this already, but just being able to have strong communication, develop our relationships with our students, to know them. And then again, being mindful about our disability related challenges. So any of our curriculum that's designed to address visual needs, or, you know, if we're highly requiring reading and there's, you know, an issue with that, then we have to be mindful of those elements as well. So other areas of cultural competence that we want to be mindful of is that, you know, these are students in an online setting. And again, this is kind of true across the board, that have often a wide variety of people that they've never had the opportunity to work with before. And this provides some great depth and some richness in our experiences. I know for me, I've grown so much just in being able to have experiences outside of my regional area and circumstances. And that's always a great thing. But I think for sometimes that can, for some students in cultural competence, that creates a rub. So we start getting naturally challenged in our graduate programs. I know that was the place where I was really having to do a lot of my own insight work, and here's where this doesn't seem to fit with what I believe, but it's how I was raised, and how do you do all of that? But then you're in this online setting, and that becomes really hard to navigate sometimes, because you're having these conversations and you're kind of facing your own issues, and maybe you believe something, and you know, in your regional setting or in your family of origin or in things like that, those are appropriate conversations or things to say, and yet they're not in this this new format in this area. So that's kind of something that we have to be mindful too of in online and education at a distance. So like before, just wanted to throw out a couple of examples of things that I have run across in my experience. So we had, for example, in the first one, a couple of students who are role-playing a counseling session, and one is counselor, one is client. The client is sharing a story about her very close relationship with her brother. They've always been close. Their family is very close, and it's not uncommon for her, if she's just had a really hard day, for her to call and tell her sister-in-law, hey, I need my brother to come over and give me a hug. I've just had a really hard day. And so this is the client talking to the counselor, and as the session ends, we do some processing as a group, and one of the fellow colleagues in the class says, you know, this really looks like enmeshment. I'd be really worried about this client. There could be potential, you know, not violence, but just violations going on, and I'd be worried about that. And the realization that for this client, the story is real. So we have a student who, this is her life experience, and they're bumping up with another student who's saying, you know what, this feels really weird and icky to me, and I don't really like it. And how do you then have that conversation in an online setting with your students and be respectful of the student who is playing the role of client, and also the student who's having a new cultural experience and really trying to understand where that sits. So I know we're short on time. I will have you ponder that, and maybe we can talk about it if you have questions, or if you want to add something to the chat, certainly feel free to do so as well. The second example is a cultural awareness activity. So the students are asked to write down a personal experience or fact about themselves that others wouldn't know by just looking at them. And then the instructor takes the anonymous feedback, redistributes it so that every student then receives someone else's identity to say out loud, to kind of own for that other person. But one of the students has a visual disability and has to publicly acknowledge then that she's not able to read the information out loud without getting another student to help. So in that case, then the student is having to publicly disclose something that they would not otherwise have to do. And ironically, it's in the middle of a cultural awareness activity. So not very culturally aware. And in that, I will just say, I think in this situation, it was handled very well in as much as the recognition was paid to this was poorly done. You know, the idea is that clearly we established a process that did not pay mind to the fact that there would be potentially clients or students with disabilities that this would pose problems for. So in terms of best practices in this area, we've again talked about this already, but really facilitating strong connections with our students whenever and however possible is really important. It creates a community. It allows a student to feel heard and seen. I think that in doing that, you're going to get much more of a connection with the student, and they're going to disclose and they're going to talk to you in a very kind of the way that Laura mentioned or Corinne has mentioned around being able to have that phone call, or just it feels like a conversation and a dialogue versus something where someone has to hide something or feel threatened in any particular way. So I think that's great. Being mindful of disability accommodations and then proactive in reaching out to your student and how they want to get that support. So students have the right to disclose again what they want or not. And then your job is just to simply be supportive of that and really be honoring that in whatever capacity you can. And then certainly being willing to refer. So some students in online just don't know that disability accommodations or services exist. So I've found that definitely in my role, just being mindful of what is available and how do I support that student and how do I connect them with resources has become important. And then, you know, I think this is a kind of hard and fast. Following up with students by phone or video, you've heard again us talk about this. Anytime there's a conflict, anytime something comes up, to me, the best solution is just getting that person on the phone and let's talk through it instead of kind of trying to interpret written communication and what do you think I meant and here's what I think you meant and vice versa. Phone calls are really great, and I think just kind of get at the root of the issue. There are also times that you have to address it then in the larger context of the class. So you can address it one-on-one with the student, but then there may be times you have to go in and say, okay, here's an example of, and that was certainly true of that first example where I felt the need to have a corrective moment and really honor both perspectives, but also not leave that hanging in the air for the class. And then finally, I think it's important just that we're always acknowledging our own mistakes and recognizing that in the work that we do, we're not perfect. We're going to screw up. We're going to say the wrong thing. We're going to say APA versus ACA or vice versa. We're going to, you know, have a day where we mistype something or we call someone by the wrong name or we interpret something poorly. And so I think being good models, as was mentioned earlier, is probably the best option we have as well. So I ran through that pretty quick. I know we're low on time. I don't know if anyone had any final questions or thoughts, but we would certainly be happy to entertain those.
I haven't seen any questions come up that we haven't addressed in the chat so far. So if anybody has one, you can speak up. I think it's really important. I actually had a conversation with a colleague about this too, with clients. And it's really important to maybe just have a conversation at the start of services, like, listen, I can't accept things on social media, you know, or whatever those boundaries would be. And then following up with that, if somebody is persistent in sending you messages, not just ignoring them, because that is also taken a certain way sometimes, but being open to addressing that and having ongoing conversations, not just a, you know, one and done conversation, but continuing to open that up.
Laura.
Yeah, Laura, you're on mute.
Sorry. Okay. I wanted to just highlight that it's such an important point to make that a lack of response is in fact a response. So I don't think I just think that's really critical and a really important point that you made. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone for coming, and thank you for spending your lunch with us.
Thank you for the presentation.
You bet.
Thank you.
Well, have a great day.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.